It was never easy, but of course now it has become far more difficult, more than one can imagine.
Which is my next question, of course. So given the complexity and the difficulty of the landscape prior to Erdogan's coming to power, how would you say things have changed?
I think it should be understood very clearly that Erdogan was fully aware of the playbook by which these media proprietors were operating, and also the nature of TRT, powerful state broadcaster. And he was very quick to learn whatever he was missing in, and he was studying it very clearly, very astutely, and understanding that this structure, which constituted the Turkish media sector, was something that he could easily manipulate with. And I would say his approach was, not inventing something, but continuing, creating some malicious patterns based on continuity. He made things worse. And he used these weaknesses that media proprietors had, whatever they had in their bags, in their baggages. He shrewdly collected those data. And also, despite the calls for reform in early stages, very early stages of the AKP rule, when a lot of people were expecting reforms, wave of reforms, thanks to the European Union membership accession process, he postponed this reform to transform TRT from being a state broadcaster to public broadcaster, independent and free from advertisement pressures, different, political or economic influences, etc. He never did that. On the contrary, he gradually took more and more control over TRT, but also one after another, he started devouring those big media groups. Either first, I would say, in the first stage, by threatening them and by playing one against each other. It started with Uzan Group in, I think it was 2004 or 2005. Very powerful group, but he managed to crush them. And then slowly but firmly, he continued doing so. And another pattern emerged, and we will maybe go into this after Gezi protests, that he even went further and deeper by seizing media groups that he thought was posing a great threat to his existence and his power position, mainly beginning with the Gülenist media and also, in addition, the Kurdish media segment. So continuity, very strong and successful malpractice in ending up with the media under his as prisoner, or shackled by him and his team. So that was what was happening, and until Doğan Group, run by Doğan family, was the last final resistant group in the mainstream media. But again, using their weaknesses, because there were patterns or patches of corruption in the history of that family, and he forced the owner to sell the company, big media group, most powerful, to a flunky business family, Demirören's. So this was, the short history of how the Turkish media sector was turned into in terms of journalism, of course, ruin.
And was there any one moment in your professional career when you suddenly sort of realized the full extent of this, what you say, more of the same but better, this kind of state capture?
I started sensing that when I was working as news ombudsman for Sabah Daily, which I had started to work in 2005, and ownership changed in 2000, and I think it was 2008 or 7, when Al Bayrak Group, the father of his son-in-law, Berat Al Bayrak, the family, when they took over, when they bought under very murky circumstances, Sabah Group. Initially, there was a very strong, dignified, decent group of editors and columnists in Sabah, and the hope was that, in a slight comparison to what happened to Wall Street Journal and Murdoch, there was a hope that editorial independence, whatever there was pretty strong editorial independence at that time in Sabah, would not be touched, would not be interfered with. But slowly, we could feel that there were some changes in the newsroom. Some editors were appointed, and because I was an ombudsman, I had a separate room in there, and people started coming to me and in person, behind closed doors, complaining to me about the interferences. And I think the most significant, a turning point for me was about his intentions. Erdogan's intentions was in the final days of 2011, when 34 Kurdish villagers, mainly smugglers, were bombed, massacred by Turkish jets in Roboski, in the border town of Roboski, Turkish-Iraqi border. And due to, I think, partly due to fear, but also partly due to indirect instructions, there was a 18-hour blackout of this news, across the media sector, with the exception of, small news outlets and parts of social media, which was not then that powerful at that time. That blackout woke me up, and I saw that with such a weak and meek media, Erdogan can go at any length. And between 2011 and 2013, when Gezi protests erupted in May of 2013, there were also, patchy incidents where, one columnist gets fired from one newspaper, 2 columnists or 2 editors, are dismissed, etc. And Gezi became another huge, very powerful, wake-up call, like a, church bell. And at that time, we witnessed Erdogan personally calling the media proprietors openly, and basically confessing that, telling that I called this, not to report about these protests. And they bowed, and there was huge amount of self-censorship in those weeks, and it disgusted me. And I wrote a couple of very critical articles in Sabah, criticizing Sabah. That was my job, of its shortcomings. And those were censored. And as continuity of my protests, I wrote a long article for OPEC section of New York Times. And that led to the, my firing from Sabah. So those were 2, I think, Roboski, 2011, end of 2011 and 2013. Those were the 2 times huge wake-up calls. When Gezi protests started fading, I was 100% sure what he aimed and what his intentions were at the end of the day.
And were there divisions in the ways that you and your colleagues reacted to this landscape? I mean, it sounds like you wrote some public articles and you essentially got fired, but was that a common practice, or was it more of a sort of editor takes a reporter aside quietly and tells them not to publish, or is there a chill effect? How did the editors generally respond, and how did your colleagues, reporters, generally respond?
Usually 1 or 2 incidents help the editors and reporters realize what the red lines are. I witnessed a couple of rantings in newsroom in Sabah, where the editor openly said, "You shall not report about the Kurdish political movement anymore." Nothing. And nobody raised a voice. Nobody objected in 2 of these meetings that I witnessed. And people got the message. I don't see that more than that was necessary. I think this was enough. Also, columnists who could publish something, but if that created dismay at top levels, his or her columns were discontinued, or they were given, as some of them told us later on, some warnings by telephone or by visits that they should not go deeper with this. This was the pattern. So I would say majority, because at the end of the day, for most of them, it's all about making a living in a tough environment. Overwhelming majority had to obey, had to abide by whatever was instructed to them. So again, as I elaborated in my paper for Harvard, this cemented a culture of self-censorship. It started it got set in their backbones. They didn't even need to go and discuss certain sensitive stories amongst themselves. They had this instinct to censor, put aside certain stories or comments without any further interference. So this was how it was happening.
So obviously, for people like yourself and others working in the media, despite maybe it sounds like a general agreement not to publicly acknowledge some of this, people would have known what was going on. Would you say that was true also of the general public in Turkey? I mean, we still have newspapers, TV stations, obviously, all the sort of engines of the regular press exist. They're just not reporting on certain things. Does most of Turkey think that the press is free, or do they, or were they aware of what was going on at the time?
The public polls and surveys constantly showed that trust and credibility issues regarding Turkish media was always very low. It remained low, and public is strongly aware of the weaknesses and shortcomings and corruption in a way, however they perceive it. They feel it, but there wasn't any sort of way for them to protest. There was only one single incident, actually, during Gezi protests, because it was so obvious. It was in the heart of Istanbul. People were very aware of this wave of protests and, attacks by police, etc., violence. And one TV channel, NTV, the competitor to CNN Turk and Haberturk, which were all self-censoring. But NTV somehow stood out with some obvious self-censorship. So people gathered before the building and wanted to enter. It was a large crowd, actually, that wanted to enter and meet the management. And they were blocked by the guards. But as a result, some editors resigned that day. And knowing that NTV was owned by a person or family who also owned Garanti Bank, some people went further by, basically canceling their bank accounts from that bank. But it was a very short history. It was maybe 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and it died down. That's the only sort of public protest that I remember. But I would say that Turkish public is aware of that. Disbelief in Turkish media, Turkish journalism is pretty strong. But then, different segments, like Kurdish media segment, has its own devoted, loyal, followers. Tiny leftist press is also continuing to have its own loyal followers. But people, I think part of the reason people read less and less newspapers is that. It's just that. The total number of national circulation, more than halved. I think it's now nearly 1/3 of the national circulation, which was in the middle of the 1990s was about 6 million. Still very small for a country like 80 million in population. But now it's around, if we believe the official figures, it's about total circulation is around maybe 2 million, maybe less. And we are speaking about, 35, 40 newspapers, national newspapers, and also local newspapers. So it's part of the reason that people don't buy newspapers anymore as they used to in the 1980s or 1970s.
So do you think that the wider public has found other means of getting access to, truthful reporting?
Well, there is a generational change. Two things happen. The main bulk of the voters or population in the heartland of Anatolia, in small cities, towns and cities and villages, they resort more and more to TV after the deregulation in the 1990s, and up to 90%, according to UNESCO, I think 87 to 88% of Turkish public get news and comment only from TV channels, private or TRT, state broadcaster. This is one pattern. Excuse me. Second one is, of course, the generational change and internet, which means that, the urban, mainly youth, are more and more into internet. The national penetration is, I think, about 65% right now, but concentrated in urban areas. Izmir, Ankara, Istanbul, of course, and Antalya, Mersin, etc. So Bursa. So there is this divide now, but that didn't necessarily make online journalism, internet, news sites, etc., more efficient, more powerful, or as powerful as once the newspapers were. The most powerful media without any doubt, is TV. And whatever happens in social or in news sites in online is less significant. That is the reason why the power in Ankara has, like in Russia, in Putin, or Belarus, or in Egypt, they have their eyes on TV. The one who controls, the power who controls the TV medium is mainly controlling the inflow and outflow of information and public discourse, whatever there is. This is what's been happening. So despite the fact that the Turkish public is aware of the weaknesses and flaws of Turkish journalism, the fact doesn't change that they are watching TV for free. And of course, it is highly biased, to say the least.
So, given all of that, let's turn to something more hopeful. Tell me about your paper, Aval, which I believe was launched in 2017. Why did you launch it, and what were some of its successes and failures?
Well, as you know, things have changed drastically following, I think, turning point was Gezi protests. You would easily say 2013 was the turning point, because it was basically testing Turkey at that time until 2013. Somewhat, the EU accession process reforms were taking place. I have to give this background because then, in order to be able to make, what happened afterwards more clear. When the AKP took over, came as a result of the economic crisis at the end of 1990s, 2002 until 2007, I would say, another turning point, the assassination of our dear friend Hrant Dink. There was a wave of reforms. More than 600 laws in accordance with the EU regulations changed. And there was a thaw. There was a period where, we were becoming more and more hopeful about the freedom, independence, and pluralism of the press. And we had a much bolder approach to reporting and commenting. And then the first test came, in my opinion, in 2013 May, where the freedom of assembly, freedom of demonstration, freedom of expression came really to a massive collective test in the main square of Istanbul, and that test was failed by Erdogan himself, despite some protests from within his party. And from then on, everything went south. And that year was crucial. It ended with two massive corruption probes, which landed like bombshells into the agenda, and that led Erdogan to change course in order to save himself. And he approached more and more to his earlier sworn enemies, the militarists and nationalists. And from then on, we started seeing more and more pressure on internet, especially, not only conventional media. 2014, we saw one news outlet after the other being shut down. He went very hard on Gülenist media, which he saw as the culprit, as launching warfare against him as a family, as his person, which is very important for Erdogan. And then the Kurdish peace process, which was then happening, was shut down, and then we ended up with huge change in 2015 summer of violence, because the Kurdish peace process had ended was ended by Erdogan himself, which led to a wave of acts of terror in Ankara, in Suruç, etc., scared the hell out of people. And in the following election, November 1st elections in 2015, he won with a landslide. But it didn't stop at that, because the disagreements and fight within the echelons of the state was still continuing. I think as a result of Syria policy, corruption cases, Erdogan's moving away from NATO or Western sphere, all in a bundle led to this coup attempt, which was a nightmare. And after that, first target were journalists and academicians, and also parts of the judiciary, and also a lot of different parts of the bureaucracy. But that was the reason why some of us found ourselves outside Turkey. We had to leave. My main motive was I have to leave because I want to continue to operate as a free, independent journalist. Some of my colleagues did not or could not leave, and many of them ended up in jail. In those days, I was writing for Süddeutsche Zeitung. Straight the day after, literally the day after the attempted coup, chronicling whatever happened during those days, and during state of emergency, which was declared days after the coup. And then I was approached by a media proprietor based in London, and we agreed. First my idea was to launch something only in English, because there was a void, there was a huge vacuum about covering Turkey, story of Turkey. Everyone was wondering what's going on, and the coverage was sporadic and patchy. But our conversation led to a sort of trilingual operation. So we had like 4 or 5 months during 2017 summer to prepare, and we launched Ahval to cover Turkey. The idea was basically to cover the major stories and have them commented and analyzed by independent, diverse, sometimes in disagreement, but independent commentators, analysts. Because in English, there was no more any independent source of information. Hürriyet Daily News, which was in English, had lost a lot of blood. And rather wisely, Erdogan established Daily Sabah. He saw that official information in English, in terms of a lot of manipulation, was necessary. TRT World followed in English, in other languages as well. So there was, and there is still, a big vacuum about fairly accurately and honestly reporting and commenting about what is happening in Turkey. So this is where we are, actually.
Which, of course, brings me to my next question, which is, what do you think needs to be done in order to fill that vacuum and bring some real reporting, not just to Turkey, but to the world at large?
This is like a $65 million question.
If only.
The ideally, of course, I hate to think and express this, but these developments, especially in the past 6, 7, 8 years, make me think often about what was happening during Cold War years with Radio Liberty, Radio Free Europe, etc., and what has been also happening after the Ayatollah revolution in Iran. There there was an exile media of those times. There still is now because of the war between Russia and Ukraine. And ideally, now the circumstances should force us to think that the most powerful way of reaching Turkish audience would be by TV, by establishing a TV medium, which is very expensive and which requires a lot of engagement from funders. And radio could be also as not as influential as TV, but still would make a difference, would make an impact. Both of them are lacking. There is one RTTV broadcasting from outside, but it has to use another satellite, Hotbird, instead of the Turkish satellite, that a lot of people cannot turn their dishes to that satellite. There is this monopoly of TV channels in Turkey. I think the best way is to still continue with in the internet, online, with commentary and multimedia combined, and expand from there. Because as far as I see, Turkey approaching these existential elections in 2023, in its centennial, is risking to glide into a deeper and more oppressive autocratic rule. And everyone should get prepared for that. It is an important country, geopolitically, of course, and it will continue to be important, despite the fact that even if it falls into the hands of a hardcore, relentless autocrat, even more oppressive, it will still continue to be an important country, whose story has always been fascinating in terms of journalism. So I think that should be the way. We outside, let's say in exile, in the democratic sphere of the world, have this potential and ability and know-how to do so much more than our colleagues who are feeling the heat more and more. And they will do so more and more, because as we approach the elections, we will see, I'm afraid, much more severe consequences of what they try to, even if they try to do whatever requires of their profession. So I think the time is crucial for accepting the fact that there will have to be a long-lasting, whatever you call it, exile or diaspora media. A lot of Russian, for example, journalists have left Russia, and since the war started, Belarus is the same. I expect the Hungarian colleagues also maybe being forced to leave. So we should acknowledge this fact that there is this phenomenon, and however much we have if we have the resources, we can still keep the flame of freedom and democracy alive. That's, I think, what we should do.
Given everything that you've just said, how significant are the presidential elections in Turkey next year?
As I said, existential. I think these elections will be far more than choosing deputies or the leader. They will be a referendum for the future course of the country. People will decide between darker form of autocracy, lifetime leadership compared to maybe to those in Central Asia, or a choice maybe to open the gates again for the possibilities for democratization. I'm not saying open the gates for democracy, but open the gates for possibilities of democratization. The situation is very complex, and the odds are on Erdogan's side. The referendum will take place, I call it referendum, under the severe control of state institutions, High Electoral Board under control of the palace, also a Directorate of Communications, which is like a Goebbelsian form of department with a 35-story building in Ankara, controlling the entire media, including social, and radio television Supreme Board, which is dominated by the parties of power, AKP and MHP, and also the departments, ministries, security forces, judiciary. So that referendum will take place under nearly impossible conditions. That's why, keeping the venues of information open is crucial, as far as I see it as a journalist.
And given the level of control that he has, how do you think Erdogan will try to seize the narrative as the election approaches?
He is already doing that. As I mentioned in our conversation, there are only a couple of TV channels, maybe 3, and they are partisan. They represent main opposition party, and they are having Damocles sword over themselves by RT UK, the Supreme Board of TV, which can fine and shut them down at any moment, depending on the instructions coming from the palace. And the narrative is already under control to a high degree. Those who follow social media can find ways to learn what's happening, and also the tiny leftist media, newspapers. But the question for me has always been the same. Does this go to the main bulk of the voters in heartland Anatolia? I have very strong doubts about that. The TV channels, for example, have been openly warmongering about Syria. Habertürk or CNN Turk, which is a shame for CNN International, by the way, and NTV and all the other channels that either directly or indirectly controlled by the palace, they are pouring out this nationalist, offensive nationalist narrative to the people. And we cannot say that the watchers are left unaffected by that kind of narrative. And in many cases regarding the stories of corruption, abuses of power, these TV channels have adopted the role of quasi debates, where the participants are mainly univocal. And even if they sound like critical of the power, they are apologists of what has been taking place at the end of the day, because they are always the same people. And also those who would contribute powerfully to the non-official narrative, as you mentioned, it is very important, are either blacklisted, and those people who are heavyweight academics or experts, etc., either blacklisted or are irked by the current climate, and they are unwilling to participate in those debates, because as soon as they express what they really mean, they know that they would run into trouble. Anything can happen if you express yourself bravely and boldly in TV channels. We have seen many examples of that.
So for you, given that environment, what is the most important thing that journalists and, activists who want to see a free press restored, or at least efforts made to restoration in Turkey, what is the most important thing you think that they can do?
As I said, I think the unity, as much as we can, is important. And in professional sense, strategic thinking. I tried to elaborate on this in our conversation. I think that is the most important thing. And we see the demise of our profession everywhere, not only about Turkey, but Turkey is a very sort of, it's a very spectacular case in terms of demise. We should really stick to protecting our profession and try to overcome our differences in terms of, ideological inclinations, etc., and focus on what we really need to do in order to inform the Turkish public. And this is a challenge. This requires a lot of work. And we should get together and show a force of unity in terms of, just what we do. And not fall into sort of, partial activism for one party or another, or one movement or another. Just do what we need to do.